What's up, everybody? Good late morning. Hope you guys are continuing to do well today. And first of all, before I get into the actual main content of this video, I want to let you guys know once again the stream of the Hawk's Nest is starting in about an hour. And some of you guys might be thinking, well, there's not going to be a lot to go into because the Bears game was a week ago and it was a stupid game, and the Seahawks are eliminated and they're playing some backups against the Rams this week, and the game doesn't really mean that much. So you might be thinking, like, well, what are you going to talk about? We're probably going to talk about some bigger and broader things than just this last game and the next game. So tune on in. Starts at about noon. Me and him going to talk about stuff. We're going to be fielding questions from the chatters, and we're going to be trying to just figure out where to go from here. I know that a lot of fans are at least partially tuned out on the 2024 season. And I mean, it makes sense why, right? Like, I don't think you need to be a scientist to understand why people are less interested now than they could be. But we're going to talk about all kinds of Seahawks stuff. So tune in. Hope to see you guys there. Everyone have a good time there. I know we got a college football playoff game starting at about 1:15 or so. So I don't know how long the stream's going to go, to be perfectly honest. We might end up wrapping up not too long after that game starts. But check it out. All right, so moving past that, this is normally where I would do the rooting guide, right? I would normally do the Seattle Seahawk rooting guide here. I would normally talk about what we need to happen in other games that have nothing to do with the Seahawks. I would talk about how we need this team to win because of strength of schedule or strength of victory. I would talk about how we need this team to lose because they're an NFC team that could compete for a wild card. But we don't really need to do that, right? There's really not anything to be said anymore because we're eliminated. There's really nothing that can happen that would get the Seahawks in the playoffs. Maybe the league would find out that one of the teams cheated. Like, they discover that, hey, I don't know, the Minnesota Vikings were like stealing powers from other teams' players like Space Jam, and then they kick the Vikings out of the playoffs, and they're like, okay, Seahawks, you're in. I guess that could happen, but short of that, there's nothing going on, and there's nothing to root for there, right? The results of the other games don't really matter that much, even if something like that did happen. So there's going to be no rooting guide this week, but I instead want to briefly go over the kind of the flip side of all that. Because with the playoffs officially out of reach, some people are going to be wondering, I don't know what's going on with my microphone lately. It keeps spiking. Okay, I think that's better. Um, the draft. Well, can you move up in the draft if you lose and other things go your way? So I want to be clear about something here. That to me is a mentality that you might have if you are one of the worst teams in the league. If you are a team that is like 2-14 or 3-13, and you go into week 18 and you need one more loss to lock up the number one pick, and a win could push you down to like 4 or 5, then maybe at that point you actually want the team to lose. You actually want things to break their way so they keep that pick, and you're not really going to be motivated to root for a win. I get it then, especially when there's a really, really good prospect out there for you to draft. You're already really bad. The season's already an abysmal failure. What's one more log on the fire at that point? I get that. But in a circumstance like this, where the team already has a winning record locked up and they're already picking near the middle of the draft, even if there is some possibility of them moving up several spots, I don't think that that's worth losing sleep over. I don't think it's worth getting into. Just let the chips fall where they may, and the difference between picking like 12th and picking 14th might end up being, not only will it likely end up being relatively insignificant, it could even end up flipping on you just as easily. Like the Houston Texans were trying to tank probably to take Bryce Young. They won the last game because Lovie Smith decided he didn't feel like tanking. So instead they got CJ Stroud. They're probably pretty happy about that. So even at the top of the draft, that stuff can happen. Last year, if the Seahawks had picked like 19th instead of 16th, we might have gotten Quinyon Mitchell instead of Byron Murphy. And, I can only speak for myself here. I loved Quinyon Mitchell. I love Quinyon Mitchell. I think he's an amazing player, and I think I'd be happier with him than Murphy. But that's a discussion for another time. The point I'm trying to make is there's no guarantee you can even get the higher pick and have it work out well for you. But that's subjective. Some people could argue, hey, it's actually makes sense to root for a slightly higher pick. And I mean, on a technical level, there's a little bit of merit there. But let's take a look at Tankathon here. Let's take a look at the current draft order. Let's zoom in a little bit here. And here's the issue. And I don't know if issue's the right word, but here's what's going on. The Seahawks currently hold the 18th pick. And there's a decent chance that they are locked into the 18th pick no matter what happens this weekend. If they are not, then they can only move up one spot, it looks like. So let's take a look at this. The Seahawks are in 18th, right? The Seahawks are in the 18th slot, and they could not move above that. They cannot go high. They cannot go lower than 18. Because the teams that are going to be picking 19 through 24 are the playoff teams that are going to play in the wild card round and lose. So they cannot have a lower pick than a team that makes the playoffs if they don't make the playoffs, right? So they cannot do worse than 18. 18 is the floor. But where is the ceiling? Well, if you look at 15 through 16, you have Miami, Cincinnati, and Atlanta at 8-8. All three teams tied at 8-8. Miami has the highest pick of the three teams because they have the worst strength of schedule, 0.415. The Bengals are next at 0.478, and the Falcons are next at 0.518. The Seahawks actually have a middle-of-the-road strength of schedule, 0.504. So that is higher than the Bengals and the Dolphins by a pretty good margin. So if this stays where it is, and the Seahawks lose, and the Dolphins, the Bengals, and the Falcons win, the only team they would move ahead of would be Atlanta, because Atlanta is the only team with a stronger SOS. So if that is how things play out, the only team you're moving ahead of is the Falcons. So you go from 18 to 17. And that's if Atlanta wins. And they play Carolina. They'll probably win. But that's not a guarantee. I mean, I believe Carolina already beat Atlanta this year. So who knows if that even happens. But most likely, that is all that is at stake. What would it take for this to change? You would need some upsets to happen. You would need some surprises to happen. Like, for instance, what if Denver loses and falls out of the playoffs? Well, Denver has almost the exact same strength of schedule. So if Denver loses and doesn't make the playoffs, and Seattle loses, Denver would potentially pick lower than the Seahawks because they would have maybe, and again, this is so close, we can't even know yet, literally 0.005 versus 500 versus 0.504. So that could change. This last week could change it and flip it, right? So at this point, you can almost look at that and say, well, they're basically tied. Who knows if that works out? Tampa Bay could fall out of the playoffs, right? They could mix things up, but look at their strength of schedule. It's identical to the Seahawks. Tampa Bay and Seattle have identical SOSs, and what happens in this final week is going to change whether or not one team is ahead of the other. And I believe every other team here has clinched, right? Like Houston's in no matter what. The Chargers are in no matter what. The Rams, the Packers, the Steelers, the Commanders, I'm pretty sure all these teams are already locked in. There's really not a lot that can happen here. Maybe there's some very specific scenario where we could bump up to like 16. where things go exactly our way over these series of games. Remember, Denver is playing Kansas City's backups, so they're probably going to win. And that's hard to get around. Tampa Bay is playing for a playoff spot. If they win, they are in. I'm sure they're going to be motivated to play hard. I think they're playing I can't remember who their opponent is. Let's actually check real quick here. I believe it's somebody who's not all that great. Yeah, the Saints, probably playing Rattler, probably playing Jake Hayner, who knows. But you wouldn't figure either team's going to lose those games. So those teams should be making the playoffs, Denver and Tampa. And again, that would cap the Seahawks at 17. So if you guys want to spend time stressing over pick 17 versus pick 18, then, I mean, go ahead and do it, I guess. But I'm telling you right now, life is too short, okay? We don't get an infinite amount of time on this planet. Spending time getting stressed out about pick 17 versus pick 18 is not the way you want to spend your life. So that's it. And that's what I wanted to go over in this video, just to point out that there's really not much to be gained here, because I've seen the comments, I've seen people say, hey, why don't we root for the Seahawks to lose to get a better draft pick? And you look at it and you're like, well, I'm not sure it is a better draft pick. I'd rather have the 10-win season. I'd rather get the double-digit wins. I'd rather beat the Rams. I'd rather have a 4-2 record in the division. I think that's worth more, as much as it isn't going to help us make the playoffs. I think that's worth more than maybe moving up one slot. Maybe. And again, I want to emphasize maybe. Because Miami and Cincinnati, they would probably have to make the playoffs to bump ahead of us. Right? One of those two teams would have to get in, which requires Denver to lose. All right. See you guys later. Go Hawks. Just wanted to make this situation clear in case people maybe don't totally understand it.